they were really looking for how to help thyroid patients, hypothyroid patients, and they found that in many patients, that test was what they considered abnormally low. When they compared it to people in general, and then they compared it in patients using thyroid hormone, the level was much, much lower. So they assumed that since the test, the level of TSH was higher in people who didn't have hypothyroidism, that patients with hypothyroidism suppressing their TSH levels were taking too much. And they sent out word for doctors the world over to cut their thyroid patients' dosages in half. That began the appearance of chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and so on and so forth, atypical depression, variety of gynecological problems. And unfortunately, it became very profitable for corporations who manufactured that test to sell it to laboratories and have doctors order it. It became immensely profitable. The profit levels were in the billions. And so now what we have is a money flow that reinforces the belief that that test is valid for deciding who does and doesn't have enough thyroid hormone regulation.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I've suffered from this myself, having had adrenal and thyroid problems, and knowing the limitations of the TSH test, which if the listeners aren't aware, it's thyroid stimulating hormone, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But exactly what you've said there is what happened to myself. I had an accident several years ago where I broke my leg very badly and had an operation to put titanium pins and screws in my femur. And after the operation, I didn't recover well at all. And what had happened is, through the stress and trauma, my adrenals and thyroid had basically shut down, or I'd become resistant to thyroid. And so after a while, I did receive the right sort of treatment, and I was on thyroid medication. But after a while, I still had plenty of symptoms. So I went to one of Australia's leading thyroid experts here. And when he did my blood test, my TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, was completely suppressed. So he decided my thyroid medication was too high. So he halved my dose. And over the next few months, I got sicker and sicker. I almost completely lost my health. I nearly lost my job because I couldn't cope with going to work. I was so depressed I wanted to crawl into a corner and stay there. And the doctor refused to increase my dose because my blood test now came back as perfect, even though I was an absolute mess. So I can sympathise with other patients who've been through that, because it is a disaster when the blood tests come back fine, yet you're really ill.
Right, and the very troubling thing to me is that when those researchers back in the early 70s decided that people were overstimulated, they found a few abnormalities, that people had a 7-beat higher heart rate nocturnally when they were sleeping, a little bit of salt in their urine, and a slightly elevated liver enzyme. They thought those were evidence of tissue overstimulation that would eventually harm those patients. And I really think that they were in earnest in expressing concern about the welfare of patients. But through the years, studies have been shown that those are just natural physiological variations, and they're completely harmless. But those researchers, nor the ones who followed them during the next 20 years or so, 25 years, ever bothered to compare TSH levels with patients' metabolic rates, which is the ultimate way to determine whether or not a person has enough thyroid hormone stimulation. The basal body temperature, the basal metabolic rate. There are things we can look for on an EKG, like low voltage of certain reflections. They never bothered to correlate the levels of the TSH with tissue measures of thyroid hormone regulation. And finally, when studies were done, lo and behold, they don't correlate. And we are about this year, we should publish the largest study that's ever been done comparing all of those factors. And what we have found, we have somewhere near 200 patients in the study. And what we have found is that if a doctor makes a clinical decision about a patient's thyroid hormone dosage based on the TSH level, about 75% of the time, that doctor will make exactly the wrong decision for that patient, worsening the patient's condition.
Isn't that interesting? Because we see so many doctors that just rely on that test, and that's it, end of story. If someone has a perfect TSH, then there's nothing wrong with their thyroid, and their symptoms are possibly all in their head.
Right, and they've created a worldwide public health crisis through it. It's marketing over the health and well-being of humanity, basically, by corporations. But corporations and high-profile endocrinologists who are on the take from the corporations. And I say that fully prepared to step forward and defend it legally here.
Yes.
The United States where the U.S. is highly litigious.
Yes.
You know,
Australia's following closely behind, believe me. Yes, but I can imagine you have encountered much resistance from the medical profession with your views, especially the endocrinologists.
Right, yeah. It's interesting that changes are beginning to occur, and I don't think, well, it's definitely not occurring quickly enough. A number of years ago, I talked with a mathematical logician at the University of Warwick in England, a man whose books have guided me in my ability to analyze research data. And he pointed out that he's very conservative and changes occur, truth prevails eventually. But, you know, when it comes to people's health and well-being, being patient and conservative and letting truth gradually prevail really bothers me. Because I see too many people whose lives have been ruined, literally thousands of them, all because of this collusion between the endocrinology specialty and corporations that profit from that TSH test and restricting patients to thyroxine. Much too slow, much too slow.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating when, you know, we know that there are answers there to help people, but there's so few practitioners that know about it, and it's really resisted by the medical profession, you know, on the whole.
Well, you know, I don't know about Australia. I have some colleagues in Australia who do research basically along the lines that I do. Dr. John Lee in Queensland is one, and there are others that I communicate with at intervals, very fine physicians who know the truth and sort of keep quiet about helping patients by violating the dictates of the endocrinology specialty, which is go by the TSH only and prescribe only thyroxine. But I've spoken at conferences in the United States with doctors who are aware that that system is horrific and has caused a worldwide public health crisis. And there may be anywhere from 500 to 700 of these, mostly MDs, DOs, over here DOs, or pretty much MDs with no degrees, that naturopathic physicians over here and probably about 20 states prescribe, and they basically are general practitioners, the way GPs are in Australia and the UK. And the audience is full of these doctors, and we now have systems where we can go online, type in a patient's zip code, mailing zip code, and find a doctor who most likely is going to give the patient quality care. So we see changes coming about, but they're coming around very, very slowly.
And why do you think the endocrinologists are so resistant to the idea of other hormone replacement other than thyroxine?
Well, because I think they have a very nice money flow going. If you, I'm probably going to come off as a conspiratorial nutcase to some people listening to the radio show, but
you'll fit in well with us. That's fine.
Well, I feel comfortable that it was that then. Well,
yeah, good.
Just consider this. There was one of the largest studies ever done of the effectiveness of T4 replacement, and that involves giving a patient thyroxine and adjusting the dosage to keep the TSH within the reference range. that dosage is inadequate for most patients. Large study done in the UK, 50%